Okay, I remember what my mother told me in these situations. When spiky-haired anime boy strangers appear before you and start talking in vague terms about saving the world, follow the 3 steps. Say no, get away, and tell someone. Though, if I'm being honest, I'd vibe with them instead. Welcome everyone to the newest installment of Finding Kyoto Animation. Today we'll be taking a look at the king who came from another world, the girl who essentially has no idea what on earth or heaven is going on, and the odd release schedule they brought with them, Munto, or Munto. Look, unlike some of the other titles in this series, this doesn't have an alternate title in either English or Japanese. Roll the title sequence. In the last video, I remarked that Kyoto Animation had continued their work as an outsourcing studio through the 90s and 2000s, and that it helped them to gain a larger portfolio of varying kinds of work that also managed to attract important industry figures. And while it's true that this is a vital part of their evolution during this span, there's another component to their success that is also worth the exploration. During the tail end of the 90s, the studio decided to harken back to their origins regarding how it would approach the future. What do I mean exactly? Recall back in the Shiawase Nani video that I mentioned that many of the early figures of Kyoto Animation were neighborhood housewives, teaching each other the artistic and animating process piece by piece. In order for the studio's future to thrive, it was determined that a similar approach would be needed, not in the sense of putting out a call to the housewives of the nation, but rather in taking steps to actively instruct and nurture any interested people in the art of creating anime, and what exactly that process would entail. Now, to be clear, the idea of mentorship of some sort in the anime industry is nothing new. Many of the prominent animators, artists, or directors during early anime's life were a simultaneous case of either learning on the fly as the medium started to crystallize itself more coherently, or learning through the art of tutelage under particular figures. Just to list a few examples, Kaneda Yoshinori, one of the most prominent and influential animators the industry had ever seen, famously learned to develop his style as a mechanical animator from studying some of his colleagues' work, like Takuo Noda, with Noda serving as the animation director on some early Kaneda projects, such as the original adaptation of Go Nagai's Geto Robo in 1974 and its sequel, Geto Robo G from 1975. Even recently, Furukawa Tomohiro, the director of Review Starlight from 2018, learned most of what they know from Ikuhara Kunihiko's direction and guidance on Maboru Penguin Drum from 2011, who himself learned about directing by serving as an assistant director to Sato Junichi on Maple Town Monogatari from 1986. Heck, even in the Nurse Witch Komugi video, I remarked that Shimbo Akiyuki's time as director on The Soul Taker had an influence on Takemoto Yasuhiro. However, Kyoto Animation sought to create a more systematized approach to the creation of anime and how to present that information. So in the year 2000, the Kyoto Animation School was launched under such a philosophy. Comprised of 2 programs initially, the Professional Training School and another program that provided some more generalized art classes, the KyoAni School has remained an integral part of Kyoto Animation's identity, both as a space for fostering talent and for adhering to the familial and communal atmosphere that the studio has become so synonymous with over time. During the course of the school's existence, various staff members who have worked on the many projects the studio undertook would themselves instruct the students in the anime process. Because the studio was so insistent upon having its students understand the professional working environment of an anime studio as part of the instructional experience, they decided to simply make a studio within the company the classroom. While this necessarily limits the locations at which instruction could take place, it offered a simultaneous, warmly informative, and cold dose of reality to any prospective students. As Kevin Surugeda comments, as positive as the experience was for many of the students at the school, it also let them know that a career in animation wasn't worth it unless they truly loved the creative process. If you wanted to learn at the KyoAni school, you weren't going to be taking any easy roads whatsoever. The diversification of Kyoto Animation's potential talent pool, as well as the larger influx of pre-existing industry talent that found their way to the studio, led to the creation of Kyoto Animation's own limited company, Animation Do, established in 2000. Primarily serving as a support studio at the time of its inception, it later came to feature or be led by some of Kyoto Animation's notable figures, including Utsumi Hiroko, who directed the Free franchise, Yamamura Takura, who would direct the Tsurune franchise, Sato Tatsuya, whose penchant for emotional outbursts and vibrating resonance are among the studio's finest hours, and a certain person who will be talked about at a later time. Truthfully, every staff member who has worked at Kyoto Animation or Animation Do that likely helped instruct the students in the KyoAni school would be worth highlighting. But for the purposes of this video, I'll focus on a rather familiar figure in the studio's tapestry. As I insinuated in the video for Curse of the One Piece, Kigami Yoshiji's presence at Kyoto Animation in the early 1990s had already manifested in stylistic changes to how the studio would approach some of its animation ideas, and that such a powerful figure in the realm of animation would have profound influence and implications on the instructional power for any future projects. His experience in working with the realism of 80s animation already demonstrated an aesthetic shifting between Shiawase Tenani and Curse of the One Piece, even though they had only been made about 1 year apart. Even though Kigami's contributions to the Kyoto Animation School would manifest most strongly as the studio expanded in the latter half of the 2000s, his involvement in the studio prior made him a figurehead of leadership and a voice for other people to follow. And his voice translated to some of the studio's less widely known output, at least in areas outside of Japan. In the early 2000s, Kyoto Animation had, led by Kigami, Tatsuya Ishihara, and Takemoto Yasuhiro, created a kind of communicative diary, the Anibaka blog, in which they would contribute or offer their thoughts on any number of things, not just anime-related content. Unfortunately, there's only a handful of captures via the Wayback Machine, so the full scope of all these years of entries is sadly restricted. But it goes to show that, in an industry where the communication between the public and the studio tends to be remarkably hush-hush, hence why it is sometimes a little difficult to navigate one's way through this whole shebang, Kyoto Animation was surprisingly forward-looking in allowing the creative personnel the chance to let themselves be a little goofier and more forthcoming with the public. Remember, this was in a time before Twitter. Reading Kigami talk about possibly wanting to watch Jim Carrey's The Grinch is kind of surreal, not going to lie. Included therein was the Kyoto Animation bulletin board system, where users could send questions to the staff, there was a link for it on the Anibaka site for easier access, about things they had been doing, and for all you know, your question could be answered by Mr. Ishihara himself. Obviously, things protected by non-disclosure wouldn't be talked about, but these sites served as intriguing mouthpieces for the studio, even if not completely unique. All of these incentives speak to communication within the studio and how it's a quintessential ingredient for productivity, instruction, and most importantly, its communal atmosphere. Given that Kigami was so vital to the aesthetic and communicative growth of the studio, it's perhaps not surprising that he'd be given a degree of freedom or control over his own artistic ideas or endeavors. As such, with Kyoto Animation about to take its first steps into their own wholly unique realms of creating anime, Kigami had the opportunity to have a story he'd kicked around in his mind be given the chance to see realization into a finished product. Thus, on March 18, 2003, the OVA Munto was released, with Kigami having served as the project's director, original character designer, storyboarder, and scriptwriter. Thus, the first truly original Kyoto Animation intellectual property was born, as unlike before with its other work, it was not derived from a pre-existing source either directly or indirectly. And ordinarily, this is where I would start talking about Munto, but before we can talk about Munto, we need to talk about Munto. Yeah, that certainly sounds a bit off when I put it like that, doesn't it? I'm giving this portion its own section because I feel like if I don't talk about it, that would be in some ways a disservice. In the video's introduction, I mentioned that Munto has a crazy release schedule, so I should probably take a quick minute to explain why exactly that is and how it relates to this whole project in general. When I started planning out the Finding Kyoto animation project, the approach that I was going to take with every property was pretty simple. Follow the studio's chronological lineage as closely as possible, talking about the shows and their later subsequent seasons as they get introduced, each one getting its own separate video, and then let that be that. For most things, that's not a problem, even for entries like The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, which has its own bizarre production history, or something like all the various installments of Free. Each series and its later seasons or films can be understood or analyzed in this particular way, but Munto itself poses a rather fascinating problem. Everything that I had said before is true, that Munto was released in March 2003, but comparatively speaking, the Munto franchise is, well, to put it a certain way, weird. If you've never heard of Munto and decided to look up the anime, you'd come across a bit of an odd duck in terms of presentation. For all intents and purposes, Munto was released in 3 chunks, as it were. The OVA from 2003, which we'll be looking at in this video, and the sequel OVA in April 2005, called Munto Beyond the Walls of Time, or Munto Toki no Kabe wo Koete, which, for the sake of my own sanity, I'm going to call Munto 2. This came out shortly after Air had finished releasing, and then there's A Fork, a 9-episode TV adaptation of Munto called The World Reflected in the Eyes of a Girl Looking Up at the Heavens, or Sora wo miyageru no hitomi ni utsuru sekai, was released in January 2009, which, again, for the sake of my own sanity, I'm just going to call Munto TV. Then a film in April 2009 called Last War of the Heavenloids and Akutoloids, or Tenjobito to Akutobito Saigo no Taktakai, was released. Yet again, for the sake of my own sanity, I'm going to refer to this as Munto 3. The thorniness comes in because the first 5.5 episodes of Munto TV are essentially the 2 OVAs, and the final 3.5 episodes were cut and pasted as Munto 3. A couple of additions or deletions between the materials are included therein, but I'll discuss those another time. For those of you keeping track at home, here's a visual aid to help you. Point being, with a format this awkward, I ran up against a bunch of questions. Do I stick to the original plan and talk about each installment individually as their own separate video? Do I talk about the first 2 OVAs at once because of the giant gap that exists between Munto 2 and 3? Do I skip the OVAs and treat all of Munto as its own video when I reach the end of the 2000s, talking only about Munto TV? But if I do that, would I be shortchanging each installment's contributions as installments to the Kyoto animation catalog? How would I handle the differences between the OVAs and the TV adaptation? Should I just stop dilly-dallying and write this damn script already? After rewatching the entirety of this franchise, as I've been doing with every installment of the Kyoto animation catalog to get the freshest perspective possible, I decided Munto as a franchise will be covered over the course of 3 different videos. First, obviously, is the one that you're watching right now. Then I'll discuss Munto 2 when we get to that point in the timeline. After that, I'll combine Munto TV and Munto 3 into one video and wrap things up there. So without any further ado, let's actually dive into this. Everything is supposed to follow a certain way of doing things. Whether it's the larger social forces that say that you're still a child despite tasting the first fruits of adulthood, or the cosmos insisting that there are certain barriers that you should never cross, there is a certain rhyme and reason to the way the universe is supposed to work, and deviating from that rhyme and reason brings consequences. There's a word for that. Fate. For King Munto, the lord of the magical kingdom and the heavenly beings who live there is no comfort to be had in knowing their fate. Heaven's civilizations have gone past the prophesied point of no return and are nearing their decline. With the denizens having exhausted their magical supply of Akuto, the wellspring that they need to survive, they will be doomed to see their universe fall and, by extension, take the entire heavenly beings' population and landscape with them. The other nations of heaven turn on the magical kingdom as they have been the biggest users of Akuto throughout the course of time. Perhaps if the elders, with Guntarl as one of their chief admirals, can direct the other nations within heaven to launch an attack against the magical kingdom, maybe they can put off their doom by delaying it, even a little bit. Then, maybe a little time can be taken to study Akuto and what its essence is. Or, failing that, perhaps they could have the chance to take a little revenge on those they feel were most responsible for dooming their world. Any attempts to change or interfere with the supposed order of things is viewed as a futile effort. The heavens cannot interfere with the lower world with the space-time barrier separating them, even as the pillars of heaven begin to fall. The lower world itself will be destroyed when the heavens fall, bringing about the end of everything. But Munto refuses to submit to such a fate that sees him and both realms destroyed. He sees a different future that has yet to be opened. With a resolve that only a fool who refuses to give up could muster, and with some assistance from the outsider Gus, who is supposed to uphold the separation between the heavens and the lower world, Munto takes a reckless dive down to the lower world, hoping to find a way to restore the flow of Akuto to the heavens. He has so many who believe and rely on his convictions, and pray that he can save everything. And to do so, he needs to find the Girl of Destiny, our hero, Hidaka Yumemi. As Munto dives down, Yumemi looks up. She herself doesn't see things the way that everyone else around her does. So often when she looks at the sky, she can only see the mysterious islands floating there, always out of reach or comprehension, coupled with the depressing apocalyptic dreams that she likewise experiences. Yumemi knows that something about her is quite amiss. There's a reason why the happiest days for her are when it's raining, because it's the only time that, when she looks up at the sky, it's the same view as everyone else, the islands not able to be seen by the gray clouds. It has been that way since she was a child, and despite the assurances from her friends Ono Ichiko and Imamura Suzume that Yumemi seeing the islands no one else can is simply the way things are, and that there's nothing truly wrong with her, Yumemi is convinced that her head is all screwed up. This separation between Yumemi and everyone else is marked by carrying around an umbrella when she often leaves the house, a screen that serves as a visual reminder that she is, so to speak, an island unto herself that no one can really fit in. Considering how often she tried to explain to other children in her youth that the islands were real, and that all they could do was laugh at her and make her feel alone, Yumemi has grown to see her own ability as a curse, a fate that she's been resigned to and can do nothing about. She's different from everyone else, and that's something that scares her. All she can try to do now is not pay the islands any mind, but when they're always floating over her, and the ground is artistically shown to be reflecting the sky above, she's surrounded constantly by literal and metaphorical reminders that she, perhaps on some fundamental level, doesn't belong. In this spirit, Munto and Yumemi are both connected by their outsider perspectives, how the ways they see and understand the world are functionally different than most others they know. But different between them are the two attitudes that the characters take in response to that knowledge. Munto's actions reflect a heart that refuses to abide by what is supposedly written, that the future and your circumstances are a thing that you can actively push against and make your own way. The method that he's taking, however, comes at great risk to his own life. As Guntarl and the elders point out when he tries diving to the lower world, there is no Akuto there to sustain him, and that as such, he runs the risk of fading away. If Munto should happen to fade, it will no doubt spell the end of the magical kingdom. A kingdom without its ruler would be subjected to the horror of needing to face an uncertain future. Or, in the case of this story, it would be more accurate to say that it would be subjected to the horror of facing a future that they know all too well will come to pass. Comparatively, Yumemi is quiet and docile. Unlike Munto, who has all this magical power and commands his own kingdom and army, she's simply a 13-year-old girl trying to survive middle school. It's not as though she can fly her way up to the islands and see what lies there waiting for her. She already has to fight against her own compulsion to keep looking up at the skies, being brought back down to earth by Ichiko calling her name. Yumemi exists in a never-ending moment of uncertainty, mirroring the heavens dealing with their own uncertain future. Thus, Munto frames the two story elements and its two protagonists as standing on opposite sides of an uncertain future, and approaching it from contrasting angles. Active opposition with Munto, and resigned acceptance with Yumemi. Such a contrast in philosophies colors their initial encounter. In a flash, Munto crashes near her and claims that he's found his Girl of Destiny, and seeks her power. Yumemi, understandably, is caught in the sheer shock of what is happening, and doesn't understand exactly what Munto is saying. When he tries to reach out to her, he finds that he cannot cross the space-time barrier, separating the two physically. However, the space-time barrier is as much a physical phenomenon in the world that keeps Munto and Yumemi apart as it is a representation of the emotional distance between them, as well as the distance between Yumemi and believing in herself or her own self-signification. Even down to Munto's physical look, that of fiery red hair, a flowing cape, and pointed ears like any number of elfin creatures, his otherworldly presence is itself an otherworldly force flying against Yumemi's plainer, melancholic grounding. So long as Yumemi isn't willing to listen to or believe in herself and what she's capable of, only seeing Munto as another thing wrong with her and how she sees the world, Munto's quest can never be completed and the Akuto will never flow again. This is why, in just about every subsequent encounter that the two of them have, Yumemi cannot help but take a dismissive attitude towards Munto's presence and everything that he is saying. She simply doesn't understand what he's talking about. And to be fair, would you supposedly understand a great cosmic conflict in which the fate of both the heavens and the earth hung in the balance, and you're the only one who can save everyone and everything? And you're only 13? This divide between Munto's active involvement and Yumemi's passivity likewise mirrors her own friends. While Ichiko is so focused on keeping Yumemi's head from wandering off by staring at the islands in the sky, trying to stand as a kind of voice of reason against Yumemi's particular way of orienting herself, Suzume is far more carefree and aloof, if not outright seemingly immature. It especially seems to come to a head when, in a moment that seems to defy everything sensible, she declares that she is going to get married to her boyfriend, an 18-year-old named Kazuya. Naturally, as any concerned friend would, Yumemi and Ichiko are kind of shocked about this, especially since Suzume isn't exactly someone that seems like they can take good care of themselves. But after talking to Kazuya and being assuaged of worries for the most part, it's understood that the marriage is a symbolic one of trying to move on. Specifically, it's trying to move past what everyone says or thinks of them, to carve their own destiny. For Suzume, it's to be with a person who still has so much that he can give the world beyond whatever delinquent reputation he has earned for himself through his actions, and how she sees beyond that. For Kazuya, it's to metaphorically put his past behind him so that he can say that he did something for and within himself. Such an action would have reverberations for the person he loves and for himself. Neither one of them is supposed to be doing this or seeing their relationship in this way. Whatever everyone might insist, their marriage is an act of amorous defiance. Suzume's decision, as well as meeting Kazuya, ultimately leads Yumemi to begin the steps towards starting her own kind of pushback against what keeps her contained within herself, rhetorically posing a question to her mother about what if she were to get married now. When her mother states that Yumemi is still a child and that getting married or being an adult means shouldering the responsibilities and duties to a society, Yumemi can only respond with a kind of indignation. After all, as a child, her responsibility is that she doesn't have any real responsibilities other than being good and getting good grades, and not acting irresponsibly. With Yumemi's mother, and combined with her own misgivings about herself, internal and external inertia impose themselves upon Yumemi. The statements and actions of those around her fuel her own immobility and inability to trust Munto when he visits her. As the heavenly beings continue to war and we see the trust of the magical kingdom's populace riding on Munto's success, it parallels the marriage between Kazuya and Suzume. The marriage is now shown to just be crossing the deep river, but it's not without its crises. As brethren in the magical kingdom fight and get injured, with overwhelming odds stacked against them as pillars from the heavens gradually start falling one after another, Kazuya throws his own caution to the wind, reaches out and catches Suzume before she washes away. Holding her fast as they complete the crossing, a crowd of onlookers cheers them on. For someone like Kazuya, someone whose life up until this point has been defined by the reputation of his physical strength and behavioral lashing out, this is anything but familiar. And even Ichiko, herself so resistant and skeptical of Kazuya and Suzume's motives, cannot help but be moved by the display that she sees. The more reasonable and grounded of Yumemi's two friends sees new possibilities unfolding before her through the friend that she doubted so much beforehand. It is because Suzume saw the world in ways that the others didn't that she could change the course of several lives, even if for some, those changes only last for a moment. They do get scolded. And it is this act, along with Munto's persistent interference throughout the past 2 days, that Yumemi acknowledges the truth. It is not necessarily about having supposedly great cosmic power so much as it is the power of believing in oneself and their own conviction, however unusual they might appear. Her gift is not a thing to run away from, but a part of who she is, and to accept it as a vehicle for change rather than stasis, to translate how she sees the world into actions that only she can do. It is what makes the ability to turn the seemingly unbelievable or impossible into the believable and the possible. It's okay to be scared, and it's okay to not want to face it, but things cannot go on simply by standing still. Her acceptance thus shifts from resigned to propelling, her own form of active opposition akin to Munto, that her own future is not to be written in melancholic outcomes or mindsets. Munto, at the near cost of his life and still absolutely refusing to die as his Akuto starts to fade, reaches for Yumemi one more time. And Yumemi, this time changed by seeing those around her push with all their might against the doors that keep them restrained, channels her own confidence and breaks through the barrier of space-time, reaching Munto and finally connecting with him. She doesn't understand why she is so integral to Munto, nor does she understand what Akuto necessarily is, but she takes the leap and trusts him. With the Akuto finally released, stability has returned to heaven and the magical kingdom, and when Yumemi finally awakens in the arms of Ichiko, she says that she finally saw the islands that Yumemi had seen for so long, floating in the sky, always there above her. By connecting across space-time with Munto, Yumemi unveiled the truth of the world as she understood it. For as much as Yumemi was only one single girl, it was because she could finally take a chance on herself and share her vision with two different worlds. And there lies the real crux of Munto. Whatever power you have inside of yourself, you are more than capable of using it to become the best version of yourself, to realize that whatever potential you have is indeed lying in wait to come out. You don't need to break the boundaries of space-time. Just trust that you can make a difference, perhaps a bigger difference than you yourself realize. You can break down the walls that the universe insists you must be contained within, and find what you're capable of on the other side of the rubble. That belief in yourself is the true Akuto within, which the heavens need, and a simple girl helped Munto rediscover. For now. Back in the Shiawase Nani video, I remarked that one thing that tends to color a fair number of Kyoto animation series is the idea of a male protagonist being introduced to a fantastical world through the arrival or greeting of a female character. While Curse of the One Piece may have taken the approach of having the supernatural arrive to women via a piece of female clothing, Munto instead has the idea of the female character being introduced to the fantasy via a male character. Sort of. It's important to note that Yumemi's ability to see the islands in the sky does not directly involve Munto, as according to her own backstory, she had been able to see them for several years before the OVA begins proper. Nevertheless, the intersection between fantasy and reality is established through the tonal juxtaposition as explained to us as audience members, that an otherworldly presence physically and affectively stands alongside or against the world as we know it. Such a similar idea would be a feature of some of the Studio Key adaptations like Clannad or Canon 2006, while the incorporation of direct fantasy powers in a more traditional sense would be employed in shows such as Beyond the Boundary and Myriad Colors Phantom World. If Shiawase Nani established this as a running feature, Munto helped codify it into something more narratively ambitious. In that spirit, Munto stands as perhaps the full fusion of everything that the studio had been amassing artistically up to this point. Just to briefly touch upon a couple of things, it takes Shiawase Nani's incorporation of the abstract by making it a more concrete presence, Curse of the One Piece's penchant for more realistic character motions and smoothness along with the camera positioning affording new visual perspective, and Nurse Witch Komugi's sense of timing and willingness to use action as a vehicle, only this time for higher stakes drama rather than comedy. There's very little to laugh at during the course of Munto, or at the very least, there's very little that you're supposed to laugh at. Even as it synthesized the components of Kyoto Animation's prior works into its own aesthetically, there are still leaps that Munto took that were not so reliant upon its older ancestors. Compared to everything beforehand, Munto is far more action-driven narratively in terms of how the heavenly beings are positioned as characters and forces within the story, with the Union and the Elders closer in standing to that of an evil empire. Characters fly across the screen, and we see both close and far positionings to get the scope and intensity of what's transpiring. Two visual elements that must be emphasized as well are the effects, which are far more of a presence both as a device within the actual story, such as the space-time barrier, and the animation features. Nearly every time Munto appears before Yumemi, it is accompanied with colorful flashes and rushing movement, physically announcing his presence both literally and as a foreign element to Yumemi's world through a foreign visual cue. There's also the OVA's use of 3D models or CGI, which... well, let's just say that they aren't exactly going to win any awards anytime soon, but I've always been fond of late 90s and early 2000s CGI anime jank. Also of relevance is that Munto stands, like I mentioned before during the context section of this video, as the first wholly original intellectual property in the Kyoto animation canon. There are two things that we can take from this. One is that, when viewed in the larger context of the studio's work throughout the rest of their history, Munto is quite unusual in that respect, assuming that we aren't counting the numerous commercials that the studio has produced over those years. We're talking larger narrative pieces, after all. Of all the other properties that happen to share this distinction of originality, the standouts are two little OVAs from 2017 and 2019, Baja Studio, or Baja no Studio, which also has an extremely similar name to the Mexican film studio, and Baja Studio, Baja and the Sea, or Baja no Studio, Baja no Mitaumi. Interestingly enough, both of these little ventures have the listed director as Miyoshi Ichiro, one of the pseudonyms that Kigami often employed during his career. It reflects that even deep in the studio's history, long after they had firmly established themselves in the larger anime community public as a source of quality, Kigami would still be given the latitude to handle endeavors that don't fit into the studio's usual mold. To put it another way, when a hand is needed to handle something original, Kigami seems to be the person that Kyoto Animation would rely upon, just as assuring then as he was back in the studio's earlier years. The second thing that we can take from this uniqueness position is that, while it is true that Munto has no original source to draw upon, it is indicative of the studio's desire to embrace original ideas as things worth considering for animation. On the surface, this sounds like a given. Obviously, any studio that thinks an idea worth making animation for will do it, otherwise, why bother doing it? But given Kyoto Animation's history, one could make the argument that these early formative 2000s, the production of Munto, and its subsequent TV version in 2009, incentivized the studio to encourage the proposing of other original ideas for consideration. The KyoAni school had already been up and running for a few years by the time Munto came into being, and cultivating the visual side of development could itself be complemented by another approach for story development or submission. I'll be getting a little bit more into this when we get to Season 1 of Love, Chunibyo, and Other Delusions, but one could possibly argue that Munto was a factor in inspiring the annual Kyoto Animation Awards. One other thing that needs to be remarked upon with Munto and how it fits into the larger Kyoto Animation canon is hinted at in the character designs. I haven't spent that much time talking about them in the previous videos, instead offering more commentary on the animation of those characters rather than design emphasis, like with the stylistic differences between Shiawase Tenani and Curse of the One Piece. Here, though, it's worth examining, and because of this, aside from Kigami, the Kyoto Animation studio figure we need to take a quick minute to talk about is Aratani Tomoe. To expand upon what I talked about in the Nurse Witch Komugi video, she joined Kyoto Animation's staff in the midst of the studio's outsourcing period, having helped on episode 5 of Oh Super Milk-chan and eventually joining the production of Inuyasha, along with helping on the Kyoto Animation outsourced episodes of The Soul Taker that Takemoto directed. In the third year of Inuyasha's production, Aratani eventually assumed greater responsibilities as both a storyboarder and an episode director. Her understanding of character movements by taking exaggerations and compressing them into more realistic quirks or mannerisms is beyond vital, and Munto is a prime demonstration of that, and it's partially for this reason why the visual elements in Munto, from the movement to the character designs themselves, are so significant. Aratani stepped up as the animation director for Munto, leaving a lasting standard and blueprint for the studio in terms of how to display the fluidity of its work both on the animation front with the action and on the design front. Compared to nearly everything else the studio had made before, Munto stands as among, if not the, closest examples to Kyoto Animation's definition of its moe aesthetic. While it's easy to point to Air from 2005 as being the anime most instrumental in codifying this sensibility, and understandably since Tomoe also did the character designs for that, it leaves Munto in the fascinating twilight between the Kyoto animation of old and the Kyoto animation of new. Or, at least, new for the time. And they would face those new times. Though Munto would eventually return in 2005 with its second installment, Kyoto Animation was no longer going to sit idly by and let other companies have the television world all to themselves. Like Yumemi, they were dealing with a scary thought, but they were going to try. Not only that, but if they were going to make their splash, they were going to do it full throttle, pedal to the metal. Next time, the studio takes its first steps into the world of a full TV anime, and Takemoto Yasuhiro returning to the director's chair with Full Metal Panic Fumofu. A special thank you to my patrons, and a thank you for watching. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, click the bell for notifications so you don't miss an upload, donate to my Patreon, or follow my social media accounts. Links provided in the video's description. In the meantime, this has been ZNote of ZNoteTaku. Happy viewing, everyone!